Hi, this is Liz Chilsen, director of the FlexSpace Gallery, and I'm back with Deirdre Fox and Yoonshin Park, talking about Deirdre's exhibition installed at the FlexSpace at Riverside Art Center. And we had talked, just kind of mentioned the topic earlier about the idea, the sense of uncertainty, which is something that Deirdre works with in her work, impermanence, the idea of impermanence. And so I thought it might be interesting to talk a little bit about that theme and about the idea, especially in the context in which we are now, where we can't actually physically go to the gallery to see Deirdre's work.
Well, while revisiting the installation, the exhibition during my stay-at-home period, I got to think a lot about this, the elements that have the power of control and the power of freedom, or just in general as a maker or as a a human being living in this situation. And I got to think about Deirdre's own a process. She uses a lot of found object, and and those are the given material that she has to manage to manipulate and finally master the use of the found object and adapting it into incorporate it into her own practice. So I thought it's very uniquely apt for this time to think about her own process and practice.
Yeah, I think it's I think the process and the practice in terms of finding things, taking things that have an existence, already have an existence, and repurposing them and reforming them and exerting, as you say, that control, but some degree of lack of control. I mean, you're always working with materials, so your degree of control, I think, is sometimes illusory, or sometimes you think you have more control than you do. Mm. And I think that idea of what control you have, what is over something in terms of how malleable it is or how malleable it isn't, is a very sort of works or makes me think of the experience that we're all going through right now. Because I know before this, I imagined and thought I existed in a world where most things I could generally exercise some degree of control of. I had a routine, get up, go to work, come back, go to the studio, work in the studio. And now I do get up and work, but I don't go to work. I don't go to an office. I haven't been in my studio now, in 5 weeks. I haven't actually physically been in my studio. And I don't really have real control over that. And I think this is the place that we find ourselves in. Mm-hmm. And I always think, starting from where you find yourself and working out from that space, here's where I am, and thinking, how do I project out from the space where I find myself, is a good way to start to situate in the new experience that we're all going through, and find some way of exercising some degree of, maybe not so much control, but adaptability, mm-hmm. adapting to it. And one of the things that I've had to adapt to with regard to the show that's up, I originally was going to do a workshop where I was going to have folks come in and show them how to do a little bit of the crochet with the plastic, and have them make pieces, small little pieces that could actually become part of the work, and they would be able to create within the space and add to it. And now we're not having that kind of workshop, but Liz and I and you have been talking about maybe doing that in a virtual way, where we could introduce that, do a short talk, and people could actually create at home and drop those pieces off, and that could be relayed in the future in another way in the space. And I think that's a really exciting idea, because it's moving forward and adapting to it, and also continuing to let the viewers and other people participate in the work going forward. I usually think of my work as a closed universe. It starts, I work on it in the space, and it reaches an ending, and that whole cycle is part of the experience of the work, both in me and making it, and what I want to relate to the viewer and experiencing it. So the idea that something separate could be created out of it or birthed out of it, so to speak, I think is a really exciting way to go. So
I wonder if you could talk just a little bit, because you described the work as the whole piece as a site responsive installation, and I wonder.
Yeah, I'm really focused on how every aspect of the space works within the work and how it changes or can interact with how the whole piece is experienced as a whole. And one of the things that happens is if you have lettering on the window, then when the sun comes across, it's going to make a shadow across the space. And in this case, it's going to be, a backwards name or something like that across the space. And where that exactly would lie and hit the wall, I know you and I went back and forth over this because I had actually come into the space and organized what I was doing with one idea of where it was going to go. And then when I came in to do more installation work, it was like, oh, wait, on the other window, it was higher up. I'd already kind of conceived where it would or wouldn't lie. We were able to adapt to that. We were able to move it down. But yeah, and I think even like coming into the space and walking into the space, so you're coming in through a door, and when we had the opening, the air comes through that door. So I situated one of the pieces so the lines of the work blew in the wind and the air. So it has this way of taking in the outside and carrying it inside. And then I situated a piece on the window itself that would catch the sunlight, one of the plastic bottles that would sparkle and catch the sunlight. Yeah, this is the one that moves. So this helps give some of the experience of a little bit of the experience of the work, but it's bringing again the outside with the way the air flows through the space into the work itself.
So besides the natural light and the wind and the signage that creates unique shadows in the space, you brought in two different elements to this installation compared to your previous shows. One was the lighting fixture that you installed behind the structure, and the other one was this ceramic slab, which was really which add really different dynamics to the installation to me. So would you be able to talk about these two different elements you brought in?
Yeah, so with my work in the lines, I'm used to using how the shadows work, the shadows of the lines work within the space, but we weren't necessarily able to get that kind of lighting at the time when we were doing the installation into the FlexSpace. And so there was a bit of a shortcoming in the work. And I remember you and I, Yoonshin, went out looking for lights. And I saw these ones that will make the light behind the image, which is what we ended up doing. And it was actually really cool to light up the pieces. Those were crocheted and woven pieces to have the light coming from behind up and lighting up the piece from behind. So it's almost catching the light. The piece is almost catching the light, which was cool to work with. And then the ceramic piece, which I think we have an image of the ceramic piece within there. But I started to do ceramics just before this installation at the Hyde Park Art Center. It was very much focused on ceramic as an artifact because the plastic I use is going to, I was saying the plastic, we all think of it as being disposable. It's not really disposable. It goes into landfills. It lasts for a very long time. It really is going to be part of our modern artifacts. And ceramics is a material that we think of as being an artifact and we find as an artifact. Although, the interesting thing about ceramics is once you've fired them, they're also not necessarily, they're going to last a long time, not necessarily going to break down or get repurposed. So just combining these different materials and the different weights of material in the piece and also working within the orientation of the space. This is a good image that's up here because you can see we're working in the corner of the space and really highlighting and using that corner to create physical dimension in the work because you can see the volume being created with the shadow lines and where the piece is situated. And then you get this weird flatness from the ceramic piece with the lines on it that just has the eyes stop there and flattens. but has some of the plastic coming out of it to make some of the shape of also now making a plane or a planar shape coming out. Just how all these different elements work together.
Yeah, and I really love the way the dimensionality of those lines and the way the lighting creates that sort of 3 dimensions out of these. Just that the delicacy of those lines as they're cast in the corner, the shadows are cast. It's just really beautiful that they add up together. And there's another, let's see if I can find this other image. Yeah, where there's just so many lines in that, you know, that are the works that you've made, and then the shadows that are cast.
It's I mean, it's like fleeting. You catch parts of it at a glance, and I think that fleetingness, yet still making up a whole that can be perceived as a whole, the duality of that is really interesting to me. Just to talk about this one, so you can see you have the piece, and this is where we learned a little bit more control over the light. We were able to put some spotlights in to make some deeper shadows. So you can see the shadow, which is the from the I'm like pointing to my screen here. So used to pointing at things that are physically with me, and it's not showing. But the relaying the shadow of the piece and how the shadow works and moves through the piece is something that I definitely think about as I'm making the work. But there is a synchronicity, or where things kind of come together. If you've situated most things in the right place, it then works, even if you're not necessarily trying to ultimately control the outcome. And I think that's really interesting, that you can get to this place where enough things are put in the right relationship to each other that the whole has a way of creating itself.
I don't know if my cursor can, there's this line that goes all the way across the room and keeps then going into a point at the other end of the room, which I think is really.
So a panoramic obviously distorts the space a little bit, but you can get the idea of that whole form coming all the way across the space and forming this kind of rectangular shape that gets narrower and narrower and ends where the light is caught by the piece. So it's kind of caught the light. And then this little piece that just sort of flies off and flies across the door and then comes around to the rest of the work. So just how you see it and walk through the space, creating this movement. I'm curious, since Yoonshin as the curator, in terms of her expectations of what she was expecting, and then in terms of how the installation came out, if she has thoughts on that.
Well, I'm very happy with that outcome, first of all. And then I think this was cut before, but you briefly mentioned about this interchangeable quality of 2 different medium between the text-based poem and the visual poem, and all this like newly brought into the space, the elements that newly brought into the space, this rectangular shape of crocheted pieces dangling, and the plastic bottles, and the ceramic slab, and was the little lighting. All these like new elements with different weight quality and different expectation kind of added the viewing experience, and it was the kind of like a perfect example of translating, experiencing text poetry to the visual poetry. So it's like where your eyes follows the flow of the lines, and then those like accent spots kind of let your eyes stay and come back for several times, just like the way that you read like poetry, like you go back to a certain stanza and read over this words or like lines over and over, and there is no right way to kind of read the poetry and how you experience it. It's just the way you experience the text, the whole text, the way it is. So I think the way you use the whole space as like one page or one blank space and kind of arrange this different types of elements, interconnect, and that was the best part for the viewer experience.
Thank you.
Good job.
Thank you. Thank you.